Thank you. Welcome to the October edition of our monthly adaptation community meeting. Thank you to the Atlas Project and Chemonics for hosting us here. And we are very pleased to have Dr. Moushumi Chaudhury, who is going to talk to us about a framework for assessing the scalability of projects, adaptation projects. Cool thing to me is that it doesn't matter whose project it is. It in theory, should work with whether it's Chemonics, apt, whatever, aid, DFID, GIZ. Seems great. And it's been tested in India, so we'll hear about that. Moushumi is with WRI. She's in the Vulnerability and Adaptation Initiative. Is that Heather's group?
That's right.
Okay. Previously, she was with the CCAFS program and with the FAO and elsewhere. We sent her her bio and the summary of the project around, and so I won't take any more time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. So it's a real privilege for me to present at my first adaptation community talk here in DC. And so what I'm going to do today is present to you some of the insights from our WRI report that we recently launched in August called Scaling Success, Lessons from Adaptation Pilots in Rainfed India. And unfortunately, none of my co-authors could make it, but I have two of my co-authors in the WRI DC office, and they're Heather McGray and Aisha Dinshaw, and we worked quite closely with our WRI India office as well. So just to give you an outline of my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about the need for scaling, why do we need to scale, and present to you our scaling framework, which is a significant component of this report that we launched. Insights from our case studies from India, where we tested the framework, some recommendations, and I'll end with some key messages for you. So to begin with, why scale up? We should scale up because the problem is big. Climate change threatens food security and livelihoods, and this is especially significant in rain-fed regions of the world where agriculture is a significant component of livelihoods. And as we're seeing shifts in seasonal patterns and more frequent natural disasters that threaten the ability to produce and sustain livelihoods, we really need to make sure that more and more people benefit from adaptation projects. And at the moment, what we have are numerous adaptation projects dotted along a landscape, which are really important, but they're only really benefiting a very few people. And because adaptation needs are quite significant, we want to make sure that these adaptation benefits. So again, we need to move on from one-off projects and pilots, and it's really time to think bigger. So how do you begin to think about scaling? Well, to start off with, I'd like to share with you a definition of scaling that we've used in this report. Scaling is a process that involves expanding, replicating, adapting, and sustaining successful projects, programs, and/or policies over time so that they have greater impact. So the key here really is to have a multiplier effect leading to positive changes on the ground. I'd now like to move on to telling you about the framework for scaling adaptation that we've developed. There are 4 parts to this framework, and I'll go over each of them. But before I do that, I wanted to mention to you that we've developed this framework not only through literature review, and when I say literature review, we primarily looked at literature in the development field. There's been a lot of scaling up in the health field, education field, so we looked at those kinds of resources. We also looked at what's happening in the adaptation world, and what we've done is try to merge development and adaptation experiences with scaling. And we've also tweaked our framework by testing it in the field, so we've revised it several times. And I do want to mention that our framework is really applicable at the project level. That's where most adaptation happens anyway. So we feel that this framework can be really used to assess and really hopefully to design scaling even at the start of a project. So the first part of the framework is identifying good practice indicators. And what we mean by good practice indicators is a set of processes or methodology that consistently shows positive results across different geographies and contexts, and that there's consensus in applying particular processes or methods that is beneficial. And we feel that we've come up with, this is 5 different indicators, and it ranges from incorporating findings from vulnerability assessments. It includes analysis of past and future climate trends. It provides climate information services. These indicators should address uncertainty and ensures community ownership of the project. And so what these indicators are trying to do is they should enable the user of these indicators to figure out what should we scale. And we can really do this through these process indicators. And again, these indicators are based through literature review, and we've also had interviews with various project implementers in India to give us a sense of, are these indicators the right indicators to help us identify what we should be scaling up, what types of projects, because ideally, projects should reflect at least some of these indicators. There are a couple of caveats with these indicators. First of all, I don't think all adaptation projects will demonstrate the need for all of these indicators to be incorporated. It really depends. For instance, you may not actually, let's say, need climate information services in your projects if that's not a significant issue. You can actually add or delete any of these indicators. And the other thing I want to mention is that all of these indicators may create good adaptation practices when it comes to projects, but they may not necessarily lead to successful adaptation. Because there's so many things going on outside of the project that may influence the project itself. So this is good practice, but it may not necessarily lead to successful adaptation. I'd like to now move on to the second part of our framework, which is about assessing the readiness to scale. And here, readiness refers to whether an activity is set to move on from a pilot stage to something that will create greater impact, including policy reform. And so here we have 6 different stages of readiness, where, as we all know, pilot is really about testing a new idea. So some benefits through anecdotes, let's say. In the model stage, you should be able to show benefits that are evident through project evaluation. At the good stage, benefits should be visible through several different types of evaluations. Sort of the best level of readiness is when you have benefits that is evident in various different settings, and they're externally evaluated outside of the project. And ultimately, you could have the policy principle, which basically is benefits that are evident through scientific studies leading to policy reform. And so here, there's a tendency for projects to kind of use this readiness scale in a continuum. You usually start in the pilot phase, you go to promising and model and so forth. But this really depends on the relationship between evidence of benefits and replication risk. So there's an inverse relationship here. If you want to scale projects, you definitely should be able to show benefits, otherwise why would you scale it? But at the same time, your replication risk, the risk of replicating or expanding this project or activity, adaptation activity, should be falling at the same time. So this is a kind of an assessment that you would have to make when trying to decide, should you move to the next stage of scaling. Moving on to the third part of our framework, which is about understanding scaling pathways. And here we've identified 4 actor-oriented scaling pathways. These are centralized, so we've identified centralized scaling, multi-actor driven pathways, NGO-driven pathways, and spontaneous scaling. I won't go through each of them. We can have more of a discussion later about it. But I would like to perhaps just give you a couple of examples of what we mean by these pathways. So if we take a look at centralized scaling, and let's say we have an example of we want to scale up weather-based advisory services. So this initiative if it's a centralized scaling pathway, would start from the national level. The government or a government would want to mandate the implementation of weather-based advisory services, but before it can do that, it has to be pilot tested at the local level. So you'll see the local level at the bottom there. With these lessons learned, hopefully things will start to change in terms of both practice and policy at the meso levels, and then leading to some sort of national policy reform, which will then again enable this adaptation strategy of providing weather-based advisory services to replicate multiple times again at the local level, so where you have the 3 sort of yellowish circles there, and again ultimately go back up to the national level for policy reform. And we can see something similar for an NGO-driven type of activity as well, where let's say the weather-based service is really piloted by the NGO and replicated by the NGO before it makes a change at the national level in terms of policy. So what I'm trying to show you here is that there are 2 types of pathways that are happening at the same time. One is a horizontal scaling pathway, which occurs when a project replicates across people and geographies. And this, I should mention that when projects are replicated or adaptation activities are replicated, it doesn't mean that they are copied in an exact manner across geographies. I mean, you probably would have to change certain things from one location to another depending on context, but it is ultimately about replicating. And the second thing that's going on in these pathways is the vertical scaling, so the up and down portion, which really relates to changes in policies and legislation at the national, regional, or local level even. So you'll see there's actually a complex relationship here between vertical and horizontal scaling, where sometimes you'll see projects start at the horizontal level and then kind of pick up or change things at the vertical level and vice versa. So these are kind of scaling pathways that project designers, for instance, may want to keep in mind when they start thinking about how to scale an adaptation project. So the 4th part of our framework is about conditions of scaling. And as I've just briefly mentioned, there's so many factors, both internally within the project and externally, that we need to consider if we are to successfully scale something. And we have 4 categories here of conditions: resources, partnerships, local context, and knowledge management. And just to give you some idea of what we mean by resources here, you could think of, is there an availability of a particular natural resource? Are there financial resources to support scaling? Is there institutional capacity for project staff to scale as it becomes bigger and bigger? Is there time? If I had to pick a condition, if I had to pick 2 conditions, I would say it's the finances and the time that are absolutely critical. It could take decades for something to scale, and you would have to meet the financial requirements as a project grows. When it comes to partnerships, for instance, do you have certain partnerships in place between governments and non-governmental organizations in the private sector? Because in some of the cases that we've seen in India, it really is the combination of these partnerships that can really enable scaling. It's really very difficult for one partner to do it all. In terms of local context, we need to think about gender, we need to think about ethnicity and class, because ultimately what we want to do is have a positive impact on beneficiaries. And if we're not looking at their context, their social context really, we're not going to really be successful at scaling. In terms of knowledge management, here what we've included is that we need to make sure that projects have monitoring and evaluation systems that can really help assess whether a project is going according to plan, whether it needs to be modified somewhere along the line for successful scaling to happen. And a couple of the things that I've mentioned, I mean, this list is definitely not exhaustive. It's just to give you an idea that there's multiple things that we have to consider that influences horizontal and vertical scaling. So here you have it. This is the framework in full. And so I think what is really novel about this framework is that we've added an adaptation lens to understanding scaling. And I would say this is especially the case in the first part of the framework, where we talk about good practice indicators. You really don't see an adaptation lens And the development of these good practice indicators when you're thinking about scaling, you don't really see it in just regular development projects, if I can say that. I think what is also novel here is that we've put bits and pieces together on scaling from both the development field and the adaptation field to create a framework that can be applied to adaptation projects that we have not been able to do so thus far, I believe. So who can really use this framework? We've identified 3 sort of main actors who can use this framework. One would be project implementers, and they can use this framework to build scaling potential during a project design. We've identified policymakers, and they can use this framework to develop policies and programs that support scaling. And we also have funding agencies that can use this framework to assess projects that seek scaling. I'd now like to shift to giving you some insights from our case studies in India where we actually tested this framework. So we used this framework to actually design our research questions because what we wanted to do in India is kind of get an idea of what kind of adaptation projects are being implemented and are they being scaled, what is their potential to scale. So we actually used this framework to identify or design our questionnaires. We actually applied this framework to 21 projects in India. And as you can see, they're in various parts of India that we've used. This is not very, you can't really tell the color difference here maybe. But so what we did, again, to get us through the interviews is, of course, do a significant amount of literature review, initially interview project managers from 21 of these projects. And then we decided to do a deep dive in 4 of them. And again, you may not be able to see it, but the 4 are highlighted again in various parts of India here. And the criteria for us to choose these 4 deep dive case studies is that we wanted a diverse range of case studies. We wanted to see these projects at various stages of scaling. We wanted to capture a wide range of scaling conditions. We wanted to see if they had clear pathways to scaling. And of course, the quality of the scoping interviews also helped us determine what deep dives we could do, and also the availability of project personnel to speak to us. So there were very much practical issues that we had to consider as well. And what I do want to mention is that in our report, we don't compare and contrast our case studies in terms of successes and failures, because what we want to do is capture lessons on what kind of scaling has happened and what the potentials could be. So it's not about a certain project failing or succeeding in scaling. So I wanted to share some insights from our case studies, some common factors that run across all the 4 deep dives in particular. And one is that we see that community participation and ownership is absolutely critical for scaling. In all of our projects, we had strong leadership at the grassroots level, and we also had strong partnerships between grassroots organizations and the government, whether that's at the village level or the state level. And this really helped to create ownership by both community level actors as well as the government, which was absolutely critical. The second thing that we found is that knowledge sharing and coordination among actors is key. We really need to tell each other what have we learned, what has worked, and what hasn't worked in both formal and informal manner. And a lot of these case studies have demonstrated this exchange of information. And finally, that horizontal and vertical scaling pathways can and should be mutually supportive. It's never just horizontal or never just vertical. They are, like I was saying, there's a complex relationship between them, but they need to be supportive of each other because we want to create these benefits at the local level, but we also want to inform and change policies at the national level, let's say. We have a few recommendations for implementers. First of all, we would suggest that project implementers identify activities with scaling potential and not just any random activity, and that the plans the plans to scale are really sort of ingrained from the start, from the design phase of the project. We would definitely encourage implementers to assess the readiness level using the framework, identify enabling conditions and barriers, and also visualize the pathways. So definitely the framework should help to plan at an early stage, before the project even begins maybe, just to at least have it in the back of your mind. Because honestly, I really think, what is the point of doing a one-off adaptation project if you can't see it being beneficial to others down the line? We also would recommend that implementers communicate adaptation success so that we can learn from one another, monitor results over time, and again, we can suggest that we use monitoring and evaluation systems to help us do that, and of course collaborate through partnerships and networks. And here, again, not just collaborating amongst NGOs or amongst the private sector, but really cross-collaborating between different sectors. We have a few recommendations for policymakers, one being that, that they define targets of where to scale, not only where to scale actually, but what should be scaled. And again, this goes back to the good practice indicators to help us decide what to scale as well. And of course, what to scale should definitely be evidence-based. And as I was saying, in reference to the slide on the stages of different scaling, we need to have clear evidence before we can scale anything, and policymakers should support scaling based on evidence that's really strongly grounded. Let's see. So we suggest that policymakers establish policies that enable scaling, and this I would say that here, I think policymakers really have to establish mechanisms that enable scaling. So this would mean keeping in mind certain actors and certain conditions that could help with scaling. They should align support for promising interventions. So we know that there's a lot of state level and national level programs going on, but the scaling that really starts at the grassroots level should be linked to these greater initiatives. Not only just to have that connection, but to have support from the government at higher levels to really take a project from a grassroots level and scale it up. And finally, again, to promote collaboration among farmers, researchers, practitioners, policymakers. And finally, we have some recommendations for funders in our report. And we suggest that funders initiate good adaptation through clear, replicable, cost-effective, and possibly even demonstratable technology to help us scale. We suggest that funders actually create a checklist for scaling based on our framework. And here the checklist should include various elements of scaling, for instance, the geography, the organizational endowments, the local context, what technologies do we have available to help us scale, and create a mandate to fund projects that focus on scaling. I'd like to end with a couple of key messages from our report. Again, it's time to think bigger. We really need to shift from one-off small-scale activities to those that benefit a lot more people and can inform policies. Secondly, scaling starts at the project design phase and requires dedicated resources. And again, we really strongly emphasize that scaling really starts sooner the better. I know it's very difficult to think about scaling when you may not have the resources, whatever those resources are, but there's always potential. And it's important to include that potential to scale early on in the design phase. And finally, adaptation activities can achieve scale in a variety of different ways. The case studies we represent in this report just give a flavor, just a quick understanding perhaps of how projects are trying to scale, but there's a wide variety of combinations out there. But what we suggest based on our framework is that we take into local context, we take into knowledge management, partnerships and networks and resources to really figure out what are the key ingredients that do we need to scale up something? There's no one silver bullet, there's no one key ingredient, but all of these factors have to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. So do you want to finish questions and I'll just get out of the way?
Sure.
Okay.
Are there any questions? Oh, okay.
I can also speak up. That's better. Okay. Thank you very much for your talk and presentation today, and it's great to see you again. One of the questions I had was thinking about incorporating this in the planning stages. A lot of times, the project program is set, funding is set, so what would you guys recommend in terms of ability to course correct and incorporate lessons learned? So as you're moving up the vertical or even horizontal scale, presumably you would want to account for that and make those adjustments. So how would you suggest doing that in the planning phases in particular? Thank you.
I'm not sure if I can repeat the whole question. Okay. Okay, maybe I'll take one or two more questions.
Hi, Lauren Keller from Winrock International. The scaling pathways are really interesting. First of all, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about what spontaneous scaling is. And second, at least in the case studies or overall, is there one pathway that tends to be more successful? I know you talked a lot about community engagement, how important that is, and if that's more prominent in any one of these scaling pathways. Thank you.
Maybe one more. Yes. Oh, okay. Sure.
Hi, this is Doug Baker from the Atlas Project. This looks like good development practice. Is there something specific to adaptation in the scale?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, these are really great questions. I think, let's see, where to incorporate lessons learned. I think it's very difficult to retrofit scaling, but I could be mistaken. So I think ideally a project should be flexible enough, should try to make sure that different actors are engaged in the design of the project itself so that there's cross-collaboration and cross-learning from the early stages. I mean, it's really tricky because as over time, certain partners may fall out, you may have change of partners, so it's very difficult to keep the knowledge exchange going. So I think there has to be a deliberate formal effort by project implementers to either informally, or I would suggest formally if it's a formal project, to establish a platform for knowledge exchange, to do this very frequently, let's say as the project picks up, to make sure that lessons are exchanged every few months. So I think unless you formalize it, it's very, very difficult to capture these lessons learned and actually share it with people beyond the project. So I think it just has to be fitted in. And I think a lot of the monitoring and evaluation systems have to, it's not just about, oh, is this project meeting this objective, meeting this target, but monitoring and evaluation itself has to connect to knowledge management, because as we're kind of assessing whether this project is going well or not, we have to ask why isn't it going well, and how can we share this knowledge amongst our partners, let's say, at least to begin with, and if not, share it with others. I think there really has to be a community of practice on scaling, and particularly exchange of knowledge, which enables exchanging of knowledge. I haven't really seen that yet. I mean, I know there are a few small ones here and there, very informal, but nothing at a grand scale, and nothing really related to adaptation that I know of. In terms of, what is something very specific about this framework that relates to adaptation? And I would say that it's really the first part of our framework, which focuses on good practice indicators. All of those indicators are related to climate somehow. For instance, one of the indicators that we suggest is we need to look at uncertainty. We don't prescribe how you look at uncertainty, but that element has to be there because uncertainty is a huge part of climate change adaptation. Just going back to my notes here, we suggest doing vulnerability assessments, and this is not just general vulnerability assessments, but they should be climate related as well. And I think, yeah, analyzing climate trends is another indicator that we suggest. It's not just about looking at historical data, but trying to figure out, what could be possible future climate scenarios that could actually affect the scaling process itself. I mean, it's very difficult to predict the future, but I think when you're designing scaling, you do have to keep in mind how this project can shift over time, and that time element includes a huge uncertainty factor that, again, is one of our indicators. So I would say that's how we're trying to build in adaptation in this. And again, I haven't come across research myself that looks at how adaptation is being factored into scaling. I think this is one of the first few attempts to do that, and our hope is that we can merge what we've learned from the development world and the very early lessons we have from adaptation, because so-called adaptation projects are still pretty new and very much at the pilot phase. We just haven't had years of experience doing adaptation projects that are called adaptation projects to really kind of develop this framework in a more advanced manner. In relation to the scaling pathways, I find spontaneous scaling very interesting. And what spontaneous scaling is about is it's something that's very informal. There are no formal players. So an example we can take is, let's say an app on a cell phone. If someone uses an app on a cell phone, let's say it's a weather-based advisory app that we have. I think it's a really great app. I'm going to tell my neighbor, he or she's going to tell the school teacher, and it's just going to replicate on its own. It's something that's done very organically, and I think this is there's really not that much research on spontaneous scaling. It's very hard to do because it's not formal. But it's something that's really catching on in a lot of developing countries, including India, where farmers do have weather-based advisory apps on their phone. And we're not really tracking have these apps been successful? Have they really scaled? And we can guess that it's scaled, but have they been useful is a different question. So you were asking whether one type of pathway is I guess more popular than others. It's a hard question. I mean, based on the 4 case studies that we chose, we actually wanted them to be very different. We wanted to demonstrate how they could be different and not prescribe any one over the other. So I'm not sure if I can really answer that question. I think if I were to take a guess, I would say that a lot of the adaptation work is really done at the grassroots level. So NGOs have played a huge role in replicating, and I would put my money on, the NGO-driven pathway more than anything right now, and when it comes to adaptation, that is. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thanks. I thought it was very interesting. This is John Perlow with USA Today. Clearly, we want to have an impact. Scaling is very important. And thinking about the slide with the boxes in the arrows,
right.
I think was your second and third slide,
Yeah.
the scaling, readiness for scaling.
Mm-hmm.
And then the one with the NGO versus the up and down approach.
Okay. This one and the one before. Yeah.
So this one, to get to the level of evidence of benefits that puts you up at changing policy, take a very long time. Yeah. There's pressure on the donor community, on the implementing community, and there's need to replicate quickly. The risk is higher the sooner you do it. Do you have anything did you learn anything in the pilots to help you? Is there a prime time? Mm-hmm. And then flipping over to the next one on horizontal versus up and down scaling, did the scaling in the NGO model, was it that they did a pilot and then they did some evaluation, they did it again somewhere else, and then did it again somewhere else? Or were they funded to do some approach in 35 villages? So did that bottom row all happen, did the scaling all kind of occur at once? And how would that relate back to the previous slide? And if you didn't get all that,
Okay. I think I'll be okay.
I have a quick question from someone that's listening online, from Lori Ashley. She states, from the case studies, did you find that any particular type of adaptation processes or technologies were more or less readily scalable?
Okay. Maybe one more, or yes.
Hi, I'm Danielle Miley with USAID. One of your recommendations was to, I think it was for project implementers, to assess the conditions of the enabling environment. And I was wondering if you could draw upon one of the case studies. And I don't know if there was one in particular that stuck out, that where the enabling environment was particularly challenging or there were deficiencies, how that was, they were able to overcome those challenges and make the scaling up successful.
Let's see. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember my list of case studies here. Let's see. Okay, so I guess the first question, did scaling happen all at the same time, or maybe one at a time? I mean, based on our projects, I think none of them were able to scale at multiple, like in many different locations all at the same time. That is extremely difficult, especially because I think a lot of these, the projects that we've developed, again, because it's sort of early days in adaptation, a lot of them are either at, I would say most of them are either at the pilot or promising stage. So it's really, really early days, and I think it's very difficult to scale without proof of concept. So none of them were funded, to scale beyond a particular village. I think there are plans for that, but again, they have to demonstrate evidence to their funders. So I think one of the biggest enabling factors is actually to have a solid monitoring and evaluation system that will tell you if you're ready to scale, and to show your funders that you're ready to take it to the next level, so they may be interested. So yeah, I don't think, on the top of my head, I mean, I can't think of, maybe some of you may know, but I can't think of any adaptation activity that has been, scaled en masse in its early days. But I'd love to hear examples if you have any. In terms of technologies that are scalable, just trying to think in these projects, I think the one thing that comes close to technologies is there has been a knowledge sharing platform. I believe in the Wasan case study that, if you read the report, you might find it there, where, I guess, whether it's through email or a web-based service, there is an actual network of actors that are ready to share information. And this is not technology related to cell phone or some sort of fancy app or anything like that, but it's a web-based platform for knowledge exchange, which has been, I think, super useful across the partners, at least, to get an understanding of what's working, what's not. So I think that's as far as it goes in terms of technologies. And again, we just don't have enough research on technologies such as I was saying, weather-based advisory services and apps on the phone, which is, very common in India. But we just don't have enough research to say anything about that, whether that technology is good and whether it's scalable, formally scalable, that is. I mean, as I've mentioned, it's scalable spontaneously or informally, but I'm not sure about formally yet. Yeah, in terms of, sorry, I didn't get your last question about enabling environments. Any enabling environment, or?
Whether it's institutional or financial or political,
Yeah.
I just wonder to me that would seem like to be a major challenge with the enabling conditions, and conditions aren't right for scaling. Maybe what some of those challenges were, how they have been overcome with these pilots.
Right, yeah.
Just as a recommendation, it seemed like it was drawing from a specific experience.
Yeah, I would say, well, across all four, definitely human resources is an enabling factor, but there just wasn't enough, and therefore it sort of becomes a barrier in the sense there's not enough people to expand as the project expands. And this again ties to financial resources. So finances, of course you need finances to scale, but it becomes a barrier when you don't have it, and a lot of these projects just do not have the financial resources to enable human resources and to enable scaling of the project itself. So I think there has to be a lot of sort of fundraising and networking that has to be done among all of these. I think they're all NGOs, I believe. Yeah, they're all NGOs that we interviewed, actually. And they need to present, again, their evidence that they should get the funding to scale so that they can also hire more people to scale. So if among all the conditions, I would say human resources and financial resources were the most critical factors. And that's across the board. Yes?
I was wondering about the comment you made earlier about sharing lessons learned and how challenging you think that is to do among, I'll call them partners, but using the term loosely, unless it's formally built in. And I guess I was just, it's not intuitively obvious to me why that would always be the case. It seems like lots of times the world is a small place, people are bumping in a similar field, or bumping into each other all the time, at the bar, at places like this, wherever. And so I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, because, like I said, just as I thought about it, I thought, well, I could see how that could happen, but I could also see it the other way. Is there, so how have you come to that conclusion?
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Chris Breen, the Atlas Chief of Party. My question focuses sort of on uptake and how uptake impacts scalability. And I know you said that in this case, if I understood correctly, in all four of the pilots you looked at, none of them had sort of reached above the promising phase. Okay, but even given that, the ones that seem like they're gathering momentum, were you able to identify any sort of causal link to a methodology or anything else about that specific activity that was, sort of readily understandable and easy for to convey that knowledge to other people and therefore to get that kind of uptake that would lead to it, either scaling within the same area where the activity is working, or actually jumping, to another area and being replicated somewhere else. I just wondered whether you would have been able to identify any of those kind of links.
Sure. Yes, over here.
Hi, I'm Glenn with Practical Action. I guess my question was, you were talking about how human resources is often a big constraint on this, and I was wondering if there was any information that came out of your research that kind of shed light on whether or not more community-based solutions versus more, I guess, NGO-driven or top-down driven solutions have a better chance for scale.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, the question of informal and formal knowledge exchange, I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, informal knowledge exchange plays a huge, huge role. I mean, we do it all the time. But I think what we want is, ideally want a balance. We can't just say that informal is the best way to share knowledge. Because first of all, if we're not kind of documenting knowledge, we have no reference point as to whether this piece of knowledge will work in the future. We have no way to analyze, really like technically analyze whether a certain lesson is actually working. You know, I could say one thing, someone else could say something. These are really important conversations informally, but it's not enabling us to analyze through a very objective lens as to whether what we're saying is actually a good lesson that we've learned. It's tricky. It's a very, very tricky balance. I think having something formal on paper to be able to share it across the world is an advantage which you can't really do informally necessarily. I mean, if I have something to share from a village in India, it's very difficult for me to share that lesson learned with someone in the US informally.
You're talking about data sets.
Data sets and what has worked, what hasn't worked. It's not just about data, but what enabling conditions, for instance, has affected my project, and I would like to share that with someone halfway around the world that's also having to deal with the same climate impact. So yeah, that's the way we're looking at it. I think in terms of uptake, I think the biggest sort of enabling factor for uptake across all the 4 case studies was community participation and ownership of the project. Because if you don't have buy-in from the community where the adaptation project will actually be implemented, it's going to be extremely difficult to scale, because it's not just about external forces coming in and changing something, but it's about working with the community to see, how can we benefit them, and how can we take these lessons to perhaps benefit a different community. And again, we would actually have to have probably the same conversation with a different community as we scale. But it's absolutely important that the community, that this project builds sort of what we call in our report adaptive capacity to deal with the project, to deal with scaling, because scaling is not just about the project growing, but the community itself would have to change as the project scales, as it affects more and more people within the same village. So having those conversations with the community and for them to agree for you to not only implement, but to also eventually scale, and how that would affect other ethnic groups or other classes. These are conversations that are absolutely important for uptake. I would say that's the number one thing, and number one condition. So in terms of whether it's better to have, I guess your question was whether it's better to have projects being implemented by community-based organizations versus NGOs, or?
Yeah, just when you think about the way that human resources sometimes works as a constraint, that communities apply can address human resources issues more efficiently. In some ways, even larger, NGOs can address that in a different way. So when you think about the ability to scale, I know that a lot of times people talk about how communities can get a little bit more of a constraint there, but at the same time, the human resource capacity issue maybe is not the same because of the way that you do that work. So I guess the question is, when you compare those 2 different approaches and the spectrum of that, is there anything that shows any evidence in terms of one being better at scaling than another?
Well, at least from the projects that we looked at, it was always a combination of partners. It was never a community-based organization trying to scale something. Because I think ideally we need to draw on strengths that different partners can bring in. Community-based organizations may have a brilliant adaptation idea that they want to scale, but we need to enable communities to get funding, and that usually comes through NGOs. So, NGOs have to be able to represent their communities that they work in, and it has to be mutually beneficial relationships. And again, I think the government also plays a huge role. I mean, it's very hard to actually imagine scaling at a mass level without government support. Especially when you look at development literature, when you look at health and education, a lot of it, perhaps you can say a lot of it has been top down. I mean, in a good way, perhaps. I mean, we need schools, right? I mean, we need healthcare, and this is coming from the national level. So I think creating these linkages, vertical linkages, from the national to the local level, is critical, and the partners that fall along that vertical scaling pathway is absolutely important. So I don't think any one community or an NGO can ever do this on their own. So that's, yeah.
Hi, Nora Furman with Cascadia Consulting. I kind of have the sense that a lot of donors are really focused on innovation, and innovation doesn't always seem to be, I guess the interpretation of innovation is not always taking something promising and replicating it. It's sometimes let's come up with something new and innovative. So I'm wondering if you saw any evidence of that or ways to kind of message this to go along with the push for innovation. And it sounds like you didn't look a lot at the donor side, but I'm wondering if you saw any signs of donors being more or less emphasizing the importance of scaling up more or less than other donors and kind of how they talk about that.
Okay. Okay. So in terms of donors, we didn't interview any donors. We primarily, because of various reasons, time, finances, we were really able to focus on interviewing the project implementers. So I know from not working on this project, but a different project that I work on the Green Climate Readiness program. And the Green Climate Fund is a huge fund. You can say, I mean, it's a donor in and of itself. And one of the top criteria for a project to get approved is that it has to show transformational change. And the way in which WRI, we're defining transformational change is through scaling. So I think it's very much on the top of many agendas right now. I mean, again, I'm not talking about the India case per se because we didn't interview donors there, but it's a huge issue. I think there is a growing trend to move away from tiny little projects here and there and make sure that even if it's a tiny little pilot, that it has the potential to scale. And one thing that I'm currently actually doing is converting this framework into a tool for project implementers that they can assess whether their project has the potential to scale. And this is actually, I'm doing this actually under the GCF Readiness program. So we're hoping to make this framework a lot more usable, beyond people who actually just read the report. That's a really good question about innovation. We actually didn't touch on that word, innovation. And I'm not sure why, but it's definitely, yeah, like you're saying, I mean, it's equated to, implementing something new. But just by talking to, experts on scaling, I know that there is a small shift away from talking about just what's new, and instead talking about, what do we have that can actually benefit others. It doesn't have to be new. It just has to be able to transform. So I think it's important to move away from, innovation and newness into transformation, which can include something new, but it can also include something that is well tested. It has evidence. It's not just a pilot, that we can create this transformational change through scaling.
How does the GCF define transformation? Do they see it as scalable like you, or maybe as something new is going to be so wow-worthy that it's just going to be transformational?
Right. It hasn't provided a clear definition, to be honest. I think you can interpret it in many different ways, but I think the one thing that we feel I mean, it doesn't, and there's no definition of, GCF defines transformation as XYZ, but there are elements, you know, just by reading GCF documents, there's a strong hint at scaling. I would put it that way. Yeah. Kelly.
Kelly Witkowski in American Institute for Farmers and Agriculture. I wanted to ask you if you've worked at all on looking at adaptation as kind of a set of principles to enhance this adaptive capacity, and that's where we're seeing, at least in the ag sector, that we're having the most success. So for instance, one example is there's an agroecological way of producing rice that's basically underpinned by 4 principles, and then it's implemented through a series of practices, but that are flexible and can really be tailored for the local context in every country. And we're seeing that this has been quite effective because it's not a set technological package. It's not a top-down kind of tool, but rather it's something that we take to the producers and then they adapt it. They pick the pieces they like that are easy to implement, and then we keep pushing that they move towards, you know, the full implementation of these principles. But there's no right or wrong way to do it. And I was wondering if you had come across any other examples of things like this, because I think it's a pretty powerful way to look at adaptation. And you know, I know that we say we have to scale, but it's, as we all know, super context specific.
Yeah.
And really, adaptation is not the goal. You know, the goal is that they are still able to produce their rice and get more yield, or they're still able to. You know, I have all ag examples,
Yeah.
but I guess I was just wondering if you've conceptualized it at all that way and come across any successful case studies that, you know, reflect more of an adaptation as a process rather than an adaptation project or adaptation.
Okay. Let's see. I mean, I think maybe the framework that we're trying to that I've talked about here today, maybe you can equate it to principles, because I mean, I see this framework as kind of suggested ways of scaling. You know, again, like you said, it can completely change by context. So for instance, some of the conditions I've listed may not be applicable at all in a different context. So I think what we're trying to show is that there's these 4 parts, these 4 components. I don't necessarily want to use the word principle. They're just 4 components of the framework. Some of them, and it's flexible. You can apply certain ones, you may not apply certain ones. So when you come to actually sort of implementing the framework and using it to design projects, it's really up to the project designer to choose which part of the framework they should focus on, which, you know, should they look at all 5 of the good practice indicators, or should they look at 1 or 2? So we don't really prescribe that you have to use, you know, all these different parts of the framework, but they're just suggested ways of thinking about it, and then how you implement can be a different story. This is really what we're trying to do here is help people think about scaling at the design phase, not necessarily at the implementation phase. That's I would say a very different world, and really differs by context. And I think, I mean, yes, we do focus here quite a bit on adaptation projects, because that's where the action is through projects. But it's not to say that we don't think of adaptation as a process, because it really is a process. I mean, you know, it's about engaging different stakeholders. You need time, you need participation. It's a huge process. So I don't think in this particular report, we really focus on project and not the process. However, the good practice indicators that we've listed are actually process indicators and not outcome indicators. So we're kind of, maybe we're not using the type of language that you're suggesting, but I think that process is hinted, because you won't be able to design a project that you want to scale without going through series of stakeholder engagements and a really long process to do it. Are we okay? I'm any other questions or comments? I mean, I'd love to also hear stories from people. I mean, if they have examples of, an experience with scaling or anything really. No one?
Can I
Yes.
just ask you to put the framework up?
Yeah, sure. Oops.
We can sort of break down the formality and look at the framework, mill about, talk to each other, talk to Moushumi. Thank you very much. This is very interesting to me.
Thank you.
Thank all of you for coming. Thanks to those of you online. In November, I don't remember the date, but the third Thursday, we have, which day?
19th.
The 19th. Ari Davidoff from, I believe, UNDP is going to talk about weather early warning systems in least developed countries. And that'll be here, November 19th, 4 o'clock. Thank you. There are snacks and drinks. Please help yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.